James pushed open the door to the small diner, the familiar jingle of the bell announcing his arrival. It was a quiet evening, the kind that wrapped the world in a soft, almost sleepy silence. He shook off his coat, hung it on the rack by the door, and scanned the room. Most of the tables were empty, a few lone customers tucked into corners, quietly eating or staring at their phones. He didn't mind being alone. In fact, he had grown used to it. But tonight, as he walked toward the back of the diner, a strange heaviness settled in his chest. He chose the smallest table in the corner, the one nearest the window. Outside, the city lights flickered against the damp streets, reflections of hurried lives passing by. James sat down with a sigh and pulled a sandwich from the brown paper bag he had brought from home. He unwrapped it slowly, almost mechanically, as if the act of eating might somehow fill more than just his stomach. Being a single dad had changed his life in ways he hadn't anticipated. Nights were the hardest. Long stretches of quiet when his son, Alex, was with his mother every other week. James cherished those moments when Alex was around, but when he wasn't, the emptiness hit like a cold wave. He had grown accustomed to doing everything alone, cooking, cleaning, working, and trying, desperately, to keep life from feeling hollow. He glanced around the diner, noticing the cheerful neon lights above the counter, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the clinking of silverware from a distant table. It was comforting in its own quiet way, a reminder that the world still moved, even if he felt stuck. James took a bite of his sandwich, chewing slowly, savoring the taste that felt far too ordinary. He watched couples chat across tables, laughter spilling over in little bursts of warmth, and he felt the familiar pang of loneliness, the quiet ache of missing connection. He reached for his coffee, the mug warm in his hands, and stared out the window at the passing cars. Each one seemed to carry people with somewhere to go, someone to share a laugh with, someone to hold close. And here he was, eating alone, counting the hours until he could go home, fold the laundry, and climb into a bed that felt too big for just one person. Yet, even in this solitude, there was a strange comfort. The diner smelled faintly of fried food and brewed coffee, a scent that reminded him of simpler days, of breakfasts shared before life had become so complicated. He adjusted his coat around his shoulders and took another bite, not knowing that tonight, everything was about to change. A small ripple in his quiet, predictable evening was coming, something that would shatter the stillness and remind him that even the loneliest dinners could hold unexpected warmth, if only he were willing to let it in. The quiet of the diner was broken by the sudden jingle of the front door. James looked up, momentarily startled. A gust of cold air rushed in, carrying the faint scent of winter streets, wet coats, and hurried footsteps. Standing in the doorway was a woman, her dark hair pulled into a loose bun, strands falling across her tired but determined face. Clutched tightly in her hand was a small boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, shivering slightly as he tugged at her coat sleeve. James instinctively straightened in his seat, unsure why the sight of them stirred a small, unfamiliar warmth in his chest. The diner was nearly empty, and yet this mother and child immediately commanded attention, not through noise or dramatics, but through the quiet urgency of their presence. The boy's eyes darted around nervously, landing finally on James's corner table. He tugged on his mother's hand, whispering something too softly to hear, but the pleading in his gaze was clear. The mother glanced toward the only available table, then back at James, and for a moment, there was hesitation. She swallowed, then spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Excuse me," she began, "my son, he's hungry. Would it be okay if we stay here for a while?" James blinked, surprised. He wasn't expecting company, much less a mother and her child asking for permission to join him. His first instinct was to apologize, to insist he was alone, that the table was just for him. But there was something in her eyes, a combination of exhaustion, hope, and quiet desperation, that stopped him. He found himself nodding almost automatically, gesturing for them to sit. They settled into the booth across from him, and James couldn't help noticing the small boy's wide eyes as he took in the surroundings, the checkered tablecloth, the condiments neatly lined up, the soft hum of the lights above. He clutched his mother's hand tightly, as if holding on to her gave him courage. The mother smiled briefly at James, a flicker of relief passing across her features, and he realized she must have been carrying a heavy burden for some time. As they began to order from the waitress, James watched the subtle interactions between them. The boy's shy attempts at conversation, the mother's patient answers, the way she adjusted the collar of his coat and smoothed back his hair. There was a quiet dignity in her care, a small, ordinary heroism in simply keeping her child fed, warm, and hopeful. James felt something shift inside him. The emptiness he had been carrying, the loneliness of his solitary dinner, seemed suddenly lighter, almost irrelevant. Here was a small human connection, unplanned and unexpected, breaking through the monotony of his evening. He realized, with a warmth that spread to his chest, that sometimes life had a way of surprising you, turning an ordinary, quiet night into something meaningful, simply by letting kindness in. And so, as the mother smiled gratefully and the boy chattered softly about school and superheroes, James felt the first true flicker of companionship he had experienced in a long while, not knowing yet that this chance encounter would change more than just his dinner. As the mother and her son settled into the booth, a small, comfortable silence fell over the table. James watched them carefully, unsure how to start a conversation without seeming intrusive. The boy fidgeted with the edge of the table, his eyes darting around nervously, while the mother offered a faint, reassuring smile. There was something quiet but unmistakably human in that simple interaction, a shared need for connection in a world that often overlooked it. James cleared his throat and spoke first, trying for casualness but ending up sounding softer than intended. "So, what's your favorite thing to eat?" he asked, nodding toward the boy's half-empty menu. The question was simple, almost trivial, but the boy's eyes lit up. "Mac and cheese," the boy exclaimed, a little too loudly, and then immediately buried his face in his hands, embarrassed by his own excitement. His mother chuckled, a sound that was warm and melodic, and James found himself smiling despite the quiet ache of solitude he had carried into the diner. They began to talk slowly, at first cautiously. James asked about school and homework, and the mother answered with the kind of patience only someone who had faced long, difficult days could muster. The boy shared little stories, funny things that happened in class, the fact that he had a pet hamster at home, the way his dog barked every time someone walked by the house. The mother added little details, gentle corrections, proud glances, all the while keeping the boy laughing and engaged. As the conversation continued, James found himself relaxing. He shared stories of his own son, Alex, talking about the small triumphs and ordinary adventures that filled his life. He hadn't realized how starved he had been for conversation like this, for simple human connection. Each laugh, each nod of understanding, made him feel a little lighter, as though the loneliness he had carried so heavily was beginning to lift. There were moments of hesitation too. He noticed how the mother's gaze sometimes flicked toward the door, worry lingering in her eyes, and he realized that life had been hard for them, maybe harder than he had imagined. Yet, even amidst the challenges, there was warmth, humor, and a resilience that was contagious. James felt a sense of admiration and empathy growing quietly inside him, an unexpected recognition of shared struggles. By the time the food arrived, any sense of awkwardness had melted away. The boy eagerly dug into his mac and cheese, pausing only to talk about the shapes of the noodles or the bright orange cheese coating each piece. The mother smiled as she watched him eat, her eyes meeting James's across the table in a silent acknowledgement, a quiet bond forming between strangers. In that diner corner, amidst the clatter of dishes and soft hum of conversation, James realized something profound: connection could emerge in the most unlikely places. Even strangers, brought together by circumstance, could offer each other warmth and understanding. The walls he had built around himself, brick by brick, were beginning to crumble, not by grand gestures, but by simple acts of attention, conversation, and shared humanity. By the end of the meal, James felt a quiet gratitude he hadn't expected. In the presence of a mother and her son, his lonely dinner had become something richer, something that reminded him of the power of kindness, of openness, and of allowing oneself to connect, even when it seemed inconvenient or unexpected. As the meal went on, James noticed the subtle tension in the mother's movements. She kept reaching into her bag, then pausing, her fingers brushing the strap as if searching for something she didn't want to reveal. The boy chatted happily, oblivious to the quiet worry radiating from his mother, but James sensed it immediately, a familiar unease that tugged at his heart. When the waitress came to collect their order, the mother pulled out her wallet, only to realize it wasn't there. Her eyes widened slightly, and she glanced at James, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. I must have left my wallet at home," she admitted, her voice low, tinged with worry. "I didn't expect. I don't know if." James held up a hand, cutting her off gently. "Hey, it's okay. I've got this," he said, his voice firm but warm. There was no hesitation, no second thought. It felt instinctive, natural, an urge to help, to act, to ease someone else's burden, even when it wasn't his responsibility. The mother blinked, a mixture of surprise and relief flooding her expression. "Are you sure?" she whispered, her voice small. James nodded. "Absolutely. Don't worry about it. Just enjoy the meal." Her son's eyes went wide, and he looked at James with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "Really?" he asked, almost in disbelief. James smiled. "Really." As they finished their meal, James watched the mother relax for the first time that evening. She leaned back, exhaling a quiet sigh, and the boy laughed at something James said, the sound bright and infectious. It was in that moment that James realized the true power of a small act of compassion. It wasn't about the money spent or the meal provided, it was about the relief, the warmth, and the quiet dignity that came from knowing someone cared without expecting anything in return. He remembered the countless nights he had spent, worrying about bills, schedules, and responsibilities, often feeling isolated in his struggles. And yet, here he was, offering a simple gesture, paying for a meal, that created a ripple far greater than he could have imagined. He saw it in the mother's eyes, softened by gratitude, in the boy's bright, honest smile, and in the subtle shift in their demeanor. They weren't just strangers sharing a table, they were two people connected through empathy, kindness, and shared humanity. As the mother gathered her son's things and prepared to leave, she reached out and gently squeezed James's hand. "Thank you, truly," she said, her voice full of genuine appreciation. Tonight meant more than I can say." James felt a warmth bloom in his chest, a quiet, enduring joy that had little to do with the meal and everything to do with the connection they had forged. In that moment, he understood something profound. Acts of kindness, no matter how small, had the power to change lives, to restore hope, and to remind people that they were not alone in the world. As the mother and her son left the diner, James watched them disappear into the night, their laughter and soft chatter fading into the city streets. He sat back, a gentle smile on his face, feeling lighter, fuller, and more connected than he had in years. For the first time in a long while, James realized that sometimes, giving a little of yourself could make all the difference, not just for others, but for you too. The diner door closed behind the mother and her son, leaving James alone once again at his small corner table. But this time, the emptiness felt different. It wasn't the same hollow solitude he had carried in before. Instead, there was a warmth that lingered in the air, a quiet sense of fulfillment that came not from the food he had eaten, but from the connection he had shared. He watched as their figures disappeared into the bustling city streets, the boy skipping slightly, tugging at his mother's hand, the soft rhythm of their steps a kind of music that echoed in James's mind. He couldn't help but smile, imagining the story they would carry with them from this small, ordinary evening, a story of kindness, of strangers who had become a fleeting but meaningful part of each other's lives. James leaned back in his chair, taking a slow sip of the now cool coffee he had left untouched during their meal. He thought about how often life had felt like a routine of work, responsibilities, and quiet, lonely dinners. Yet tonight, something had shifted. A simple act, sharing a table, offering help without hesitation, had transformed an ordinary evening into a memory that would linger long after the plates were cleared and the lights dimmed. He thought of the boy's wide-eyed smile and the mother's gentle, grateful squeeze of his hand. That small gesture of trust, of human warmth, had changed something inside him. For years, James had believed that being a single parent meant carrying life's burdens alone, that vulnerability was a weakness and that kindness, while beautiful, was often impractical. But tonight proved him wrong. It reminded him that vulnerability could invite connection, and that acts of generosity, no matter how small, could ripple far beyond what one could see. As he gathered his things to leave, James felt a quiet sense of hope. He realized that life's meaningful moments often came unexpectedly, like a quiet knock on the diner door. And sometimes, the most profound transformations weren't the big, life-altering events, but the gentle gestures that reminded us of our shared humanity, the smiles, the shared stories, the simple offer of help without expectation. Walking out into the cool evening air, James felt lighter than he had in years. The city hummed around him. But the loneliness he had felt for so long had been replaced with something more enduring, a renewed faith in human kindness, and the comforting knowledge that connection could be found even in the most ordinary places. He thought of his own son, Alex, and felt a surge of gratitude for the little moments of love and attention he could provide. The encounter with the mother and her son reminded him that no matter how challenging life could be, small acts of compassion had the power to inspire, heal, and transform not only others but ourselves. And in that quiet, reflective walk home, James smiled to himself, feeling an unshakable truth settle in his heart. Even in the midst of solitude, even when life seems ordinary or difficult, the human spirit has the power to create light, to offer hope, and to remind us that no one is truly alone. Tonight, a simple shared meal had done all of that, and more.